Hello, everyone. There's been a lot of talk in the news about booster shots, and VerbPAC at the CDC had their meeting just 2 days ago, considering whether or not to approve booster shots. So I thought in this video we'll go over what are the arguments for boosters and what are the arguments against boosters. So let's get right into it. The argument for boosters is kind of outlined in this little short correspondence from the New England Journal. This is actually from Pfizer. All right, here we go. So this is Pfizer presenting this data. And of course, Pfizer and Moderna sort of have a vested interest in getting a booster because then they'll sell more of their vaccines. But this is the data that they've presented. And what they show is um, after, as you get the dose, so remember, the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine are two-dose vaccines. So 2 doses is the full dose. And what they're considering is dose number 3 as the booster dose. So this is the serum neutralization titers. So this has to do with how they serially dilute the serum of people that have been vaccinated and to see how many neutralizing antibodies are. It's measured in something called titers, but you can just think of it as the amount of neutralizing antibodies that people that have been vaccinated have. So they have been testing this against the wild type and the beta. And remember, the beta is also known as the South African variant, which was the most immune escape variant. So this is not the Delta, but this is the beta. But anyways, this is what when they did this study, the beta is what they were most worried about. Turns out that Delta became more of a problem than beta. But anyways, after 7 days after the second dose, that's when you kind of have your peak antibody levels, and you see that it's pretty high. And then at 1 month later, it drops down a little bit, and then before dose 3, so this is like 5 to 6 months later, it's dropped, significantly. And then you see after dose 3, the neutralizing antibodies goes higher, even higher than the after the second dose. And then a month afterward, there has not been much drop off. In fact, it looks like it's a little higher. And then this is in the 18 to 55-year-old group, and then in the 65 to 85 group, and this is the group that we really need to protect because they're the ones that are having the most problems with COVID. And then you see this fairly steep decline in neutralizing antibodies over time. And then the third dose does boost up the neutralizing antibodies. Then they tested this against the Delta, and you see that Delta does not have as much immune escape, right? So you see the drop off between the wild type and the Delta is very small, whereas between the wild type and the beta is pretty large. But anyway, you see the same thing. 1 month after dose 2 looks like this. 1 month after dose 3 looks like this. So you get a nice boost in neutralizing antibodies after the third dose. So that's what Pfizer is presenting. They're presenting the laboratory data for that. And then this is data out of Israel that is talking about how they feel like the third dose has been increasing their vaccine efficiency and protection amongst their population. They published this also in the New England Journal. I was going to go over this, but however, um, two of the authors, uh, Dr. Aloy Priest and Dr. Milo, they presented at this the VRBPAC meeting just 2 days ago. So VRBPAC stands for Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. So I thought I would just go. So this is an 8-hour meeting. We are not going to go through the 8-hour meeting. I am going to try to condense this meeting down to, probably 30 minutes or less. So let's kind of watch this together.
Uh, I'd like.
Okay, so this is Sarah Oliver from the CDC presenting this data. So I will kind of skip through it so that we can go through faster. Okay, so she's going to talk about basically COVID-19 cases and hospitalizations, vaccines administered, how the vaccine rollout has been going, and what the vaccine effectiveness that we are seeing in the United States is. Okay, so this is the graph of COVID cases in the United States. Remember, there was this huge spike around the holidays, and then there has been this second spike most recently, which we kind of look like it's tailing off a little bit, and this is usually, most likely from the Delta variant. So she talks about that. And then this is hospitalizations by age group. As you can see, the 65 and older age group in every wave have the highest number of hospitalizations. An interesting thing to note is that in the most recent wave, you see that the 18 to 49-year-old group and the 50 to 64-year-old group, they are relatively higher. See, like there was a huge drop off between the over 65 group and the next group down and the next group down. This one, the drop offs are proportionally less. So we're seeing a larger proportion percentage wise of this 18 to 64-year age group. And then also you see like this younger group 0 to 4 and 5 to 17. Also you see like a slightly higher bump in this area compared to this area as a percent of the total. So that's what she talks about. And then these are graphs showing the difference between vaccinated people and unvaccinated people. So separated by age groups, 18 to 49, 50 to 64, and over 65. What you see here in the light green is the vaccinated group. So in the vaccinated group, in this age group, you're like 1 in 100,000 people are being admitted to the hospital, whereas in this group, maybe about 15 to 20 per 100,000. And then in this group, looks like maybe 2 to 3 per 100,000, and maybe 60 to 70 per 100,000. And then in this group, you're getting about 10 per 100,000 and about 100 per 100,000. So 1 in 1,000 people. So you see that in terms of the probability of someone getting admitted to the hospital, there is a 23-fold higher chance, 22-fold higher chance, and 13-fold higher chance if you're unvaccinated to being admitted to the hospital. All right, so this is just a graph showing that delta represents. So, the delta is the orange here. Back in this was May, it was low, and basically the UK variant B117, the alpha variant was the dominant strain, and then quickly it became Delta being the dominant strain and represents 99% of recently sequenced lineages. So if you get COVID nowadays, it's like 99% chance you've gotten Delta. All right. This is talking about the vaccine rollout. So the most common vaccine type in the United States is the Pfizer, then followed by Moderna, then followed by the Johnson & Johnson. And then what percentage of the population is fully vaccinated? In the 65 and over age group, it's 82%. That's quite high. And this is the group that's the most vulnerable. So it looks like that group understands that they're the most vulnerable and has gotten vaccinated. Over 18, about 65% rollout. 65% of the population has been vaccinated. So here's the trend in vaccination. So it spiked up around April. That's when we were getting the most vaccinations per day, and then slowly it's trended off, and then it's plateaued. But people are still getting vaccinated. We're vaccinating, looks like almost 1 million per week. Oh, daily per day, 1 million per day. Does that sound right? Seems like a lot. 500,000 per day. Okay, vaccine coverage by age. Again, you see that in this over 65 age group, greater than 90% have over at least one dose. So that's pretty good. And above 18, like 65, about 20 over 65 have gotten one dose. So quite a few people have gotten the dose, and most importantly, the people at the highest risk, this elderly group, they're getting there's a very high vaccine uptake in those groups. All right, and then vaccine efficiency, effectiveness. Um, what they're noticing is there's a slight drop off in protection against hospitalization recently in July. And then let's go forward. against infections, there's a steeper drop off. So it's not, so vaccines are definitely not protecting against infections, but if you look at hospitalizations, the drop off is not very high. So it's basically saying infections that are severe enough for people to get hospitalized for, the vaccines still seem to be doing a pretty good job of that. All right, let's skip forward. All right, so same thing, vaccine efficiency comparing pre-Delta to Delta time points. So pretty big drop off in infections and symptomatic disease, but less drop off, very minor drop off in terms of hospitalization or severe disease. All right, let's skip forward to the next one. So same thing basically. Um, Bigger drop off. So I think alpha is blue, delta is pink. The legend is off, but you see basically there is a big drop off in infections, but less of a drop off in hospitalizations and severe disease. All right, so same thing that you're seeing. Okay, so let's go ahead to the next person, and he is a researcher out of the UK. And basically, I think he had an interesting point here because a lot of us a lot of the things are he's saying basically randomized trials provide the best estimates of effectiveness in the real world. That is true. And then a lot of these studies are quote real world studies, which initially sounds like that would be better data. It's bigger numbers and it's better. It seems like it would be better data, but he's saying that's not true, and I agree with him because basically he's saying real world effectiveness of disease vaccines should be more correctly titled estimated effectiveness of vaccines in observational studies. That's true because we're just observing. And he says actually even more accurate thing would be saying estimated effectiveness of vaccines that is biased by an unknown amount. So it's biased because there's a reporting bias. And what he talks about here is what we call confounding factors. And what that means is that like when you don't have people randomized to get vaccine or not get vaccine, then some of the people that get the vaccine, like the people who get the vaccines are not necessarily the same type of people as people that don't get the vaccines. Like for example, people that are healthcare workers may be more likely to get the vaccine because they understand that they're more likely to be exposed. And so there's a difference in the population. And also people who get the vaccine may be more likely to get tested and find symptomatic infection, things like that. So they're just not the same. So observational studies are are dependent on reporting, and there's a lot of reporting bias and there's a lot of selection bias, and we can't tell exactly which way the bias goes and what the degree of bias is. Anyway, he had some very good statements about that, but I don't want to go too much into that. Let's skip ahead to the Israeli data, and so here's um, the two speakers from Israel, and they are on that study from the New England Journal, which I was planning on going over, but they presented their own data very well in this presentation. So they're talking about their data from Israel. So again, they had a large peak in December, just like we did. So this is December, and that's when they started their vaccination. Israel has had the fastest rollout and the highest uptake of vaccines of any country with any reasonable population in the world. And so they're talking about how they had they use mostly Pfizer. They're talking about how the vaccines affected the COVID pandemic in their country. So what you see here is they started vaccinating people in December. So over the next couple of weeks to next couple of months, they vaccinated people. So not everyone in the whole country got vaccinated on that date, but then they had lockdowns, progressively more and more severe lockdowns as the case numbers went up, and then the case numbers started falling, and they basically, they started falling as the vaccination progressed, and also, the the thing comes in waves anyway too. So some amount of this decrease would have happened whether or not they vaccinated. Um, but anyways, they reopened fully back in March because they just felt by March most of their population was vaccinated and the case numbers were going down. So they just fully vaccinated. As you see, by April 1st, 2021, their case numbers were extremely low. And then here's their share of the population that's fully vaccinated against COVID-19. And so they were up above 60% by August. We're now hitting above 60%. And so yeah, they're saying they reached population wide immunity levels over 60% 3 months before anyone else. So America did actually a fairly good job of vaccine rollout, to be honest, especially a country of our size. And they have lots of testing, and their variant profile looks very similar to ours. They were mostly alpha, and now they are mostly delta, just like the United States. And so their peak now is higher than it was in back in the holiday surge. So their surge looked like this, and the U.S. looked kind of like maybe halfway up there, but they exceeded it. And it's a little bit of a like it's a little bit difficult to explain why they're having such a big spike. Perhaps because they fully opened and they had no restrictions on gatherings and stuff is why they're having a big surge. It's hard to say. It would be kind of complete speculation at this point. There's a lot of reasons. Okay, and so their severe cases also went up as well. All right, so let's see. So then they noticed that the infection rate over time went up. So this is when they got vaccinated. So they're separating this out to when they got vaccinated. So the darker the shade of gray, the earlier you got vaccinated. So therefore, it's been a longer time period since you had your last vaccination. So as you see that the longer vaccination times reflect with higher confirmed infection rates. So they're saying that the immunity wanes over time. And so for that reason, they decided to give their population boosters. All right, so we're gonna go through here, and they also observed that there was an increase of severe disease in the upper in the older age groups. But as you can see, I mean, this looks like a big number, but if you look at the scale, it's 0.1, 0.2, 0.3. So it's not absolutely in absolute numbers, it's not very large differences. All right. So basically, they showed that the vaccine efficiency for severe cases went from 97 to 85. And that doesn't look too bad, but they're looking at it as a relative risk. So 3% relative risk versus 15% relative risk. So if you have 97% vaccine efficiency, you have a 3% risk of severe disease. Now you have a 15%, which is a fivefold increase. They felt like that was worth moving on. And so they started a third booster starting in July. And it looks like the majority of their elderly population got the third booster. And basically, they showed that after the third booster, they got better vaccine efficiency. Yeah. So basically, compared to just having 2 doses, how much better were people after the third dose? And so it looks like after about 7 days is when it starts kicking in. You get increasing protection for infection. So this is infection, not severe disease. And then here you end up being, 15, 13 times more protected relatively. Okay, they calculated actually. So in this time period, if you start from 12 onward, it's 11. And if you made the box like this, it'd probably be like 15. So basically, bottom line, the third dose helps them in terms of infection. I'm not sure whether, okay, here we go. So booster provides tenfold reduction in relative risk of severe disease in the older age group. So this is um, a tenfold reduction in relative risk. In terms of absolute risk, it basically protects about 7 out of 100,000 people per day from getting severe disease. So that's how much, that's the absolute protection. And then they show this is the reproduction number, or the R naught. Their R naught was 1.33. Now the R naught of Delta was suspected to be like 8 or 9. And that's with no other measures. So that's, see, the R value is not only dependent on the virus, but it's also dependent on like population density, whether there's non-pharmacologic measures like distancing, um, not having people gather together, that kind of stuff. So they were at 1.3, and they drove the R value down to below 1. Below 1 is considered where you can start seeing a slow extinction of the virus within a population. So they drove it down to less than 1. Yeah, and they show that like they started giving the booster to people over 60, and you see like the people over 60, their cases go down. The people over 60, it continues to go up. So in any case, Israel was putting forward the contention that, hey, look, a third dose worked for us, and you guys might want to consider doing it too. And that was their kind of thought process. So Pfizer presented information saying that there was waning immunity and waning uh, neutralizing antibodies, and then Israel presented their data, and so those were the arguments for the booster. There's waning immunity. There's a drop in protection against infection, a small drop in protection against severe cases, and a booster seemed to be effective in the real world setting in Israel. However, like the guy from the UK said, real world data has some confounding factors. But you know what? That's kind of the only data we have. We don't really have randomized trials um, about these things like the delta and the booster and things like. So we have to make policy decisions based on observational data, which is not ideal, but we don't have time to do randomized studies of this level all the time as the thing is progressing. All right, so those are the arguments for the boosters. What are the arguments against the booster? And basically, these people wrote an opinion piece in the Lancet saying, why they're talking about, although the idea of further reducing the number of COVID by enhancing immunity in vaccinated people is appealing, any decisions to do so should be evidence-based and consider the benefits and risks for individuals and society. Vaccines continue to be effective against severe disease, including those caused by the Delta variant. And so they're saying basically, if you look at their supplemental data, which is right here, and I'm going to try to expand this a little bit. All right, so if you look at protection against severe disease, it's like 87% across all these different studies. And then in this group, it was 95%. And they tell you like most, which variant was the most common at the time. So like here's Delta right here, Delta right here, Delta here. And so the variant thing didn't seem to make much of it. See the Gamma variant. Oh, and this is the different vaccine, the Corona vaccine, CoronaVac, which I think is I'm not familiar what that is. This might be the inactivated virus, the Chinese vaccine. This is the Moderna vaccine. This is the Pfizer vaccine. But anyways, the effectiveness against severe disease remains high in these observational studies. These people concluded that a booster was not going to be um, they didn't think that it was. See, it says the current evidence does not therefore appear to show a need for boosting in the general population, in which efficacy against severe disease remains high. even if humoral immunity means neutralizing antibodies, appears to wane, reductions in neutralizing antibody do not necessarily predict reduction in vaccine efficacy over time, and reductions in vaccine efficacy amongst mild disease do not necessarily predict reductions in the typically higher efficacy against severe disease. So basically, there's two major arguments against getting the booster. One is it still protects pretty well against severe disease. There has not been a large drop off in severe disease. And that's what we really care about, keeping people out of the hospital and keeping people from dying. And two, the other thing that they mentioned in this study is that, there is a lack of vaccines, and there are large parts of the world that have not had access to vaccines, mainly in poorer countries. The vaccination rates in poorer countries are extremely low, and it seems to be a little unfair for the rich countries to be giving people third doses when poor countries haven't even gotten one dose. And they feel like in the setting of a global pandemic, um, that it would be a better use of the vaccines to vaccinate the poorer countries that have completely unvaccinated populations than to try to improve slightly the immunity in rich countries. So yeah, they say the limited supply of vaccines will save the most lives if available to people who are at appreciable risk of serious disease and have not received any vaccine. Even if some gain can ultimately be obtained from boosting, it will not outweigh the benefits of providing initial protection to the unvaccinated. If vaccines are deployed where they would do the most good, they could hasten the end of the pandemic by inhibiting further evolution of variants. Indeed, the WHO has called for a moratorium. So the WHO is telling people, please do not give boosters. Like it is not morally or ethically correct for rich countries to boost their population when poor countries still haven't been vaccinated. So that was the arguments against it. The VRBPAC meeting, they ultimately decided to vote against um, the booster, except in I think two circumstances. One is high risk groups like healthcare workers, they could get a booster if they wanted, and also for the elderly. So they kind of tentatively approved the booster for I think over 60 or over 65, and for healthcare workers. This doesn't mean that that's what the FDA is going to decide. There is what's called an ACIP meeting. So that's the vaccine group from the CDC. They're going to meet probably relatively soon. They're going to go over this data too and to put forth their recommendation. I suspect it'll be fairly similar. And then I think that basically it looks like boosters are not going to be a thing for the general population, but will be available to healthcare workers and other people that are considered high risk, as well as people over 60 or 65. So I hope that that helped kind of clarify the current situation with boosters, the arguments for and the arguments against the boosters, and where we are at least in the United States, on recommending boosters. Thanks.